Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On podcast, where we are focused on giving hope and strength to the entire military community. Whether you're a veteran, active duty, guard, reserve, or a family member, this podcast will share inspirational stories and resources that are useful to you. I'm your host, Scott DeLucio, and now let's get on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Drive On podcast. Today, my guest is Elizabeth Polinsky. Elizabeth is a marriage counselor in the Norfolk, Virginia area, and she's also the host of the Communicate and Connect podcast for military relationships. In this episode, we're going to talk about military families and relationships and how they are affected by military service and after the military service and when we become veterans. So welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So why don't you give us a little bit about yourself, your background, and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. So, where to start? I guess I get lots of questions about like what led me to start focusing really on couples counseling with military couples. And that is pretty much what I do. So I guess that's the real short of it, is that I'm a marriage counselor and I work mostly with military and veteran couples. But both my parents, they were a dual military couple, and they ended up getting divorced. And that was part of just like the challenges that they faced with the military life. And my mom got out of the military, and then my dad stayed in, and he actually retired from the Navy, and he struggled a lot in relationships. And so that was something that was always on my mind. And then I started working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I used to do a lot of individual and group counseling for the VA. I was one of the only providers who did a type of therapy called cognitive processing therapy for PTSD. And also did a lot of work around sexual trauma. But one of the things that stood out to me when I was working at the VA was that even though I had, I was working with veterans around mental health, so there was depression, anxiety, traumatic events type stuff going on. But a lot of them would tell me stories about things that had happened in their romantic relationships. And they would tell me that was the most painful part of their experience, or that was one of the most hard. That's not quite how you say that, right? Most hard is not the right phrasing, but one of the hardest parts about their experiences with all of their military experiences was the pain that had happened in their romantic relationships. And so when I moved to Norfolk, which my husband is Navy, so I'm a military spouse, when we got stationed here, I decided I wanted to switch to doing couples counseling, focusing specifically on military couples, to see if I can hopefully prevent some of that stuff from happening. So that is a little bit about me. I like I said, do counseling, and then I do have my podcast, which I created because I also found after starting to do a lot of counseling with military couples that it's very hard to, scheduling is very hard for military couples, just with the chaotic schedules. And then a lot of people were not comfortable with going to counseling. So I made it as a resource just so that way people could still learn about how to improve their marriages, specifically in regards to military life, whether, even if they didn't have time or their schedules didn't allow for it or their partner just wasn't willing. So that is the story.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense too, because I could imagine that in the military, there's a lot of people who move from time to time. Yes. And they may, even if they are comfortable with going and seeing you for a period of time, they may only have a limited amount of time that they're able to go and see you. And then eventually they pack up and move, and they may not have somebody that they know or trust in the area that they move to. And so if they can continue listening to you on their on your podcast on their own time, that may be a helpful addition as well. So I definitely think that the podcast angle makes sense, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But in your experience, as you've worked with various military couples and veteran couples, what are some of the challenges, the unique challenges that they face, as opposed to just say your typical civilian couple that maybe never served in the military?
Yeah. So a few different things come to my mind, and I am having thoughts about things that are specific to your active duty military couples, as well as some things that impact veterans. So I might talk a little bit about both, but let's start with just the active duty ones. So the kind of obvious first ones are deployment and long distance and the frequent moves and the social isolation and being away from friends and family, the challenges of reintegrating. Like, so if somebody goes on deployment, the kind of the rules and the routines of the family shift. And then whenever they come back from deployment, the rules and the routines shift again. So I guess we could just say it's sort of a lack of stability. The constant shifting and changing puts a lot of strain on relationships. Part of what helps relationships function is actually being in a routine as much as possible. So I would kind of lump those all together under the active duty military couple. But then with my veteran couples, and this would go for both active duty and military couples. But when I work with them in couples counseling, I find that I actually have to help undo some of the training from military life. So service members tend to be very skilled at compartmentalizing and being very logical. And most of their spouses want to know, where are their emotions? So a lot of what we're doing in couples counseling is helping service members and veterans regain access to their emotions in order to form a deeper emotional connection with their spouses, which then leads to just improved communication, decreased fighting, things like that.
So having your emotions in a box in the closet is not the right thing in that case,
yeah,
right?
It's not for a marriage.
Right. Yeah. So, but I definitely know what you're talking about in terms of the different dynamics in the family. When someone goes away on deployment, things change, and then when they come back, things change again. When I was deployed to Afghanistan, my oldest son, he was born about a month and a half before I was deployed. And before that, I didn't know, I wasn't a dad, so I didn't know anything about being a dad. Like any first-time parent, it's kind of, there's no handbook that comes along with the kid that tells you what you're supposed to do and how life is supposed to be different or whatever. And then throwing a deployment on top of that. And then when I came back home, he was already, obviously a little bit older, and my wife had gotten into a routine where she was taking care of the baby on her own, and she just kind of had it. And so I came in sort of feeling like an outsider almost in my own house. Not in a bad way. Like, my wife didn't do anything wrong. It was just like, it seemed like she just had it so nailed down. Like, she just had everything. I was like, okay, well, this is cool. Where do I step in? What do I have? I should do something. But I didn't quite know what. And so there was a little bit of that dynamic going on as well. So I know what you're saying there. That definitely could be different for a lot of people. But you're talking about the communication and talking about your emotions and your feelings. What are some of the traps that people fall into with that? I know compartmentalization of your emotions is probably one big thing, but are there any other traps like that these couples might get into, and how do we get out of these traps, and how do we not compartmentalize so much so that we are able to open up to our spouse?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind when you ask that is some research that's done at the Gottman Institute by John and Julie Gottman. I think they're psychologists, but for sure they are doctors of some kind. And they put couples in a lab, and they kind of watch couples live together for a few days and then see how they interact. And so, but anyway, some of their research talks about something called the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which are communication patterns that, if they continue kind of unchecked, tend to lead towards divorce. And so the 4 are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And so let me just think for a second how I want to explain this. So when I'm either not in touch with my emotions, or I am not in a place where it's comfortable to share my emotions in a relationship, then I tend to be left with those 4 options for communicating. And so if I'm not aware of my emotions, I might get critical or defensive, or if in our relationship, it's not a safe place for me to share my emotions, I might get critical and defensive, because those are my protective ways of trying to communicate my emotions and get my needs met. The problem with that is that if I am critical, then my partner usually responds defensively. And then when my partner responds defensively, I get defensive. And then when I get defensive, they get critical. And they get critical and I get defensive. And it keeps going back and forth until eventually we have contempt and stonewalling. And that is, I think, like the challenges around communication that couples face. Yeah.
So what is the best way to break out of that cycle? If we're in that criticism and defense back and forth cycle, and it seems like it's just going to continue fueling itself without some sort of outside action, just stopping it in its tracks and getting it to move away from that. So what do we do to solve that problem?
Yes. Well, couples counseling obviously helps. But I think the first step is recognizing that this is the loop. It's kind of like the vicious cycle that you're stuck in. Even that will go a long way because so often couples feel kind of like against each other. And if they can recognize that they're both trapped in this communication cycle, then they can usually team up against it. Once they can recognize it and start teaming up against it, then they can work on creating an atmosphere where they can share their emotions. And so one thing that they can do is, this phrase is coming to my mind that I read a few days ago. It was turn a blame into a claim. And so instead of getting critical or blaming my partner, I can claim what I need. And I can say, this is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling lonely, or I'm feeling frustrated that you didn't include me. And talking about what it is that I'm wanting or needing, instead of talking about what my partner isn't doing or what I don't like that they're doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even, thinking about some of just within yourself, your own thoughts and stuff, how your thoughts influence your behaviors and your emotions and everything, that could be a vicious cycle too, where if you have negative thoughts, it's going to create negative behaviors and negative emotions and all that sort of stuff as well. And really it's just a matter of breaking that cycle and cutting it off so that you can continue moving forward in the direction that you want to go. And I think the more complicated thing is in a relationship when there's two people, because if it's just something that's happening in my own head, I can tell myself, okay, well, I need to break this cycle and I need to do this. But if now I'm getting these outside influences where there's the other person in the relationship and they're fueling this cycle, then it's something that you have to work on together, I suppose, right?
Yes and no. So
Okay.
ideally, yes. You want to be able to work on it together. But if for some reason you're just in a very like stubborn marriage where you're really the only one working on it by yourself, that's typically not the case. But if it were, just you working on changing how you communicate will likely have an impact on your partner. There is sort of a reciprocal nature, right? So if it's a vicious loop, even if I can, let's say my partner is critical or defensive, even if I can change what I'm doing, I can stop the loop. At least, okay. Maybe not permanently. Maybe it doesn't change my partner's go-to of criticism or defensiveness, but it can change the escalation of it into a larger situation.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense, because it does take two people in that cycle, and if one of them can break that cycle, then it could help. It, like you said, it may not immediately can't cancel that out, but it may help get you to that point. So that does make sense.
Yeah, can I add to that real fast? So especially if I can get to the part where I'm sharing my more vulnerable feelings. So you had said, or had sort of talked about the mental spiral or the cycle that's happening internally. So, for example, a lot of times in couple relationships, maybe something makes me feel like my partner doesn't care about me, or that they think negatively of me, like whatever I'm doing is not good enough, or that they don't accept me, something along these lines. The natural response is to then kind of get angry, but the underlying feelings are usually feelings of some sort of like rejection or insecurity type thing. So if I can get to the point where I can recognize those emotions and then talk about those emotions with my partner, like let's say my partner gets critical, it'll change things if I don't get defensive back. That's a really great step. Like if I can do that, that's pretty successful. Okay. But then if I can go even further and say, okay, to me, that sounded critical and that bothered me. I didn't like it. That made me feel like you don't care about my opinion or something like that. That has even more power to change that cycle, because then my partner hears about their impact on me, and most partners really do care. So then that tends to influence them. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense too. I'm glad you added that in. I guess maybe before a relationship gets to that point where they're in that cycle, it would be great if they all just started off on the right foot and never got to that point and to begin with, right? But what are some ways that that couples can start their marriage off on the right foot, to get into the right cycle, as opposed to that wrong cycle that leads them down that vicious cycle that you were talking about before? Yeah.
Yeah, gosh. So I wish I could tell you it's preventable. Pretty much every couple has a cycle. It's just how extreme are we talking? But there are things that can help help improve the relationship, keep it kind of strong to begin with, that can help prevent it from being so intense. And I guess I'm thinking like where to start. So I had a wedding photographer ask me to create like this whole checklist of things for getting ready for marriage. And like, what do you do to get started off? I think I came up with 12 things. I don't know if I can remember them all off the top of my head, but one of the ones that I tell couples, like if I only had one tip to ever give a couple, it would be to have monthly marriage meetings where it's like on the calendar, we're doing it, and we're going to talk about everything that is maybe hard to talk about. So we're going to talk about how's our quality time. Are we both feeling like we have enough quality time, and how's the quality of the quality time? We'll talk about our finances and kind of get on the same page with money. We could talk about parenting in that category. My husband and I have done these for years now, pretty much since we started dating. And there are just lots of topics you can cover in them. So like we'll cover our health, we'll cover family updates, things about couples' sex lives. Those are really important conversations to have. So many couples don't even talk about it. So everything like that can get covered in a monthly marriage meeting. And then it's also a really great way to be on the same page together in general, but also to address any like big life changes. So if somebody was about to deploy or was about to move with a PCS, then we can be on the same page with our planning for it and check in with each other about those things during that time. Other things would be, so if you're not married yet, maybe planning the wedding would be something that could get talked about, or planning the honeymoon. Those types of things could get talked about during a marriage meeting as well.
Yeah, those are definitely big topics. You want to make sure you're both on the same page with all of that stuff, because that time can be pretty stressful. So you don't want to miss out on and assume that you know what the other person's thinking and turn out you're wrong or whatever. So that is a good advice to give to someone, is that communication. Having that meeting with your spouse, and communicating those hard to talk about topics, and knowing that you're in a safe place to have those conversations. Obviously, if you've gotten married, you care enough about each other that you want good things for each other, and ideally anyways, I can't say that for necessarily every relationship that's out there, but hopefully that's the case. But when you have these conversations, it's with the goal in mind of improving and bettering the relationship. So if you just keep things boxed away, whether it's emotional or other problems that might be going on, it's not going to help anything. So talking about it and having those open conversations, I think, makes a lot of sense. And if it requires putting it on the calendar to do that, so you do it on a regular basis, and then that makes sense too, right?
Yeah. Can I add something real fast?
Yeah, sure.
It does quite a few things. So especially with the hard topics, couples tend to want to avoid the hard ones because they're hard. So it sets aside a time to make sure we are talking about the hard ones. It keeps couples on the same page, and it actually helps them enjoy their time together more, because they don't have to have those conversations outside of the marriage meeting. I mean, they could if they need to, but knowing that there's a dedicated time to have a discussion around a topic like this helps couples just enjoy their date night, instead of using date night to catch up about the kids and to catch up about, my mom or your mom is sick and all of those things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because that's the last thing you want to do when you're sitting there at a nice dinner or something like that, is be bogged down with those hard topics that you maybe don't really want to discuss. And then you're like, okay, well, when's the check coming? Let's wrap this thing up. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's not exactly the place you want to be in. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that you talked about specific to the military couples, the people who are dealing with deployments or PCSing or different things like that. What are some of the things that you can do to stay connected during a deployment, and deal with the emotions of some of those harder times, outside of maybe those monthly meetings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to have a monthly meeting while you're deployed, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I suppose there is something that I got from. So I used to do these workshops when I worked at the VA called, they used something called the PAIRS curriculum, but they were called Warrior to Soulmate workshops. And so every VA has them, and they're usually free for veterans to attend, and they're typically on the weekend, 2 days, covering different sort of communication skills and relationship skills. And they're usually provided by the chaplain service at whatever the nearest VA hospital is. But one of the things that they would teach is something called a daily temperature reading. That's just what they called it. But basically it's a daily check-in. That's really tiny. So it's sort of, let me see if I can remember it here. I think it was appreciations, new information, puzzles, concerns with recommendations, and wishes, hopes, and dreams. That's sort of the order you go in. And that is something that I would probably recommend, like deployed couples where one partner is deployed. If you don't have a lot of time to talk, that is a great strategy for how to have a conversation. Or if you're going to have email chains back and forth, that's a way to stay up to date with the things that are important. So the first part is just, what do you appreciate about your day, or about your week, or about what's going on in your life? It could be related to the relationship and the family life, or it could just be like, oh, it snowed. So it snowed here over the weekend, and it doesn't typically snow in Norfolk, but I did appreciate looking in my backyard and just having like the white snow and my dog running around. That's fun. Right. That's something that I could, if my partner was deployed, I could write about under the appreciation section. Then there's new information. So just updates information. Our kids got an A in art class, something like that. Yeah. Puzzles are things that you're thinking about, that you're just sharing that you're not sure what you're going to do. So like maybe I'm puzzled about if I'm going to go to my parents or your parents for Thanksgiving since you're gone. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. That might be something that I write under puzzles. Concerns with recommendations. If it were me, I would be like, I'm concerned about your safety. I recommend that you stay alive. That's probably what I would write if it were me and my husband. But any sort of concerns, like I'm concerned about the house, this thing is going on. What do you think could be in that section? And then ending with wishes, hopes, and dreams, which is just how they would phrase saying something like positive that I'm hoping for, like like I'm looking forward to when you get back, or I hope you have a good day, or I hope you enjoy visiting whatever city you're in, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that framework, especially like you said, on a deployment when someone is pressed for time, they may not have a lot of time. If they're able to make a phone call at all, they may not have more than 5 or 10 minutes that they can make that call. And so if you stick within that framework, you're not just talking about things that are surface level. The weather. I mean, if the weather is something that you're appreciative of, like you were with the snow, that's a different story. But you're not just saying, oh well, it's sunny, it's not raining, it's all that kind of stuff. Like, okay, let's get to something a little bit more in depth here, and talk about the things that matter in that conversation, because you don't want to get to the end of that 10 minutes and then all you really found out was that it was sunny and or that it snowed or whatever. You want to get into a little bit more than just that. So having a framework in mind is a good idea. I think that does make some sense to put that together and kind of know that beforehand, before you are deployed, and then 2 or 3 months into it, all you've been doing is talking about the weather and things like that. You want to have something up front, so that you know what to expect when you're making that phone call or writing that email, when you're communicating back home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, because I hear a lot about how we don't talk, and then I finally get to talk to them and we get in a fight, or it's just like this venting thing that happens, or worse, where you just don't even know what to talk about because so much has happened. Where do you even start? So that gives people a way to start and a way to keep it meaningful and generally pleasant as well.
And what about the times when someone does have something that they need to vent about, and you may have that limited time frame to talk about things, and that does fall out, maybe outside of the framework that you just kind of laid out there, but every once in a while someone just needs to vent, and they need to get something off their chest. Maybe it's just something that's happening at home. It has nothing to do with the relationship, but they just need someone to talk to. And here you are, here's an ear, and I need to talk. And so I'm going to just dump all this stuff out on you. But, is that the right time and place to do it when we're considering deployments, when someone's away, or is that something that maybe you find another friend closer to home that you can talk to, over coffee or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's is it okay to do while your partner is deployed? That's so dependent on, based off of your partner's deployment experience, I think.
Right.
So I think the best route would be to just ask your partner, like, I have something I want to vent about. Is that okay if I vent to you right now about what's going on? And let them tell you if they're in a mental space to be able to handle the venting, or even, especially if you only have like 10 minutes, do they have something that they want to talk to you about?
Right.
It's maybe something you guys could negotiate together. And maybe it's like, okay, can I vent for like 2 minutes, and then use the rest of the time for other topics. But It is helpful to have somebody else to vent to, like a friend. Another thing that you can do is, and this may sound funny, but you can have kind of an imaginary conversation with your spouse. This is actually a really great coping skill. It sounds kind of funny, I think, sometimes when I mention it to people, but I can, sort of ask myself, what would my partner tell me if they were here and I could vent to them about this? What would they do? How would they be supportive of me? Would they have advice or recommendations? And that like sort of imagining how it would be if they were here with me is a great way to sort of, in a way, get support from your partner, even though they're not there in that moment.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't actually considered something like that, where you just think about what would my spouse do, or what would they say about whatever the situation is. But when I was deployed, my wife actually had a teddy bear, like a stuffed teddy bear, and it had on the chest of the teddy bear, there's like this little plastic window, just big enough for a picture to go in. And she put a picture of me in the teddy bear, and she just had it sitting on the bed next to her, just as a little reminder that I wasn't there, but I was still there for her, and all that kind of stuff. So it was. I wasn't there to talk to, but I can just imagine, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I could just imagine my wife sitting there talking to the bear as if that was me, and having that kind of conversation, where it's like, okay, well, what would Scott do? What would he say in this situation? So there's a lot of truth in that. I think that could definitely be a useful tactic.
Yeah, my partner, even when it's rough, just the nature of marriage is that my partner is my biggest support system. Even in the hard times, even when the marriage is kind of on the rocks, my partner is still my partner, and they're my support system. And so if I can kind of imagine how they would support me through what I'm going through, that is a really wonderful coping skill that still is about the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So in the beginning of this conversation, you had mentioned the kind of compartmentalization of emotions, and how in the military we get really good at that, and we kind of have to unlearn that over time. What are some ways that you've worked with people to unlearn those types of things and bring out those emotions? Is it something that is easy to be unlearned, or is that something that takes a lot of effort?
Yeah, I suppose everyone is different on that, on how easy or difficult it is, and probably how long they have been doing it. So, some families, even when you're a kid, when you're growing up, some families never talk about emotions, and emotions aren't something to have or talk about, and you just kind of move on. If you come from that environment and then you join the military, and then you retire from the military, and then you do some sort of like military contracting, something or other, and now we're talking about maybe like 60 years of no emotions, it's going to take a while. But if I had a family where we talked a lot about emotions, and then I did like 4 years in the military and did something else, it's probably going to be a lot shorter. But so the thing about how military members and veterans tend to cope with emotions is that they have an emotion and then they move on really quickly. But it's not that they don't have emotions. So it's like biologically hardwired in the human body to have emotions. You can't not have them. So it's really just about recognizing them and getting back in touch with the emotions. And that can be done a variety of ways. I think you could go to therapy. Different types of therapies help in different ways with something like that. But if I was just trying to think of something kind of quick and easy to start working on that, it would be especially for people who like to compartmentalize, I might want to identify my thoughts first. So every time I have an emotion, I have 3 parts to my emotion. I have a physiological response in my body, such as my heart rate going up, my breathing changing, muscle tension, things like this. So the physiological response, I have thoughts about what's happening, and then I have a behavior urge. And sometimes people are it's more easy to recognize the thought or the behavior urge because those are somehow like more acceptable parts of the emotion for military guys. So I would just start thinking about what do I tend to do and what thoughts do I have, and that will help you figure out your emotions. So if I feel angry, I might want to yell and scream or punch a wall if I'm really angry. And I might have thoughts like, this person is such a jerk, or something more intense than that. If I feel anxious, I might notice that I'm kind of thinking about how things could go wrong. I'm sort of planning for all the different contingencies. That is a sign of anxiety. And someone might notice that first. They might notice that they are planning and thinking through all the possible ways something could go. And noticing a thought like, I need to prepare for the worst. And they might be able to get in tune with that part of their emotion before they're able to label it and recognize it as anxiety. So to answer your question in a more direct way, starting to track out what are my physiological sensations, what are my thoughts, and what are my behaviors that all go together about this situation. And that will help somebody start identifying and getting in tune with their emotions.
Yeah. And that helps bring those out of the box that they have them stored away and shoved under the table or under the bed or wherever they have them stored. They start to pull those things out, and when you start to recognize them and everything, that helps to get those out there, and then you can have those more open and honest communication with your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your podcast and where people can go to find out more about your counseling if they're in your area, and your podcast if they're not, so that they can follow along and get some help from you, whether they're close to you or not.
Yeah, so I'll start with the podcast. So my podcast is called the Communicate and Connect Podcast for Military Relationships. That is very specific to military relationships. So it does cover lots of helpful tips and things for couple relationships generally, but the focus really is on military relationships and how to strengthen military marriages. And that is, of course, on like any podcast platform that someone wants to listen to it on. And the website for that is communicateandconnectpodcast.com. I also am a marriage counselor. That is my full-time job. And I am currently located in Norfolk, Virginia, but of course, we'll probably move with the military at some point. I do online counseling in multiple states. So can provide counseling in South Carolina, Arkansas, Virginia, and Nevada soon. Soon I'll be able to do that in Nevada. But at the moment, my office is for in-person therapy is at the Relationships Center in East Beach, Norfolk, Virginia. So that's where I can be found. Information about that is at elizabethpolinskycounseling.com.
And I will have links to both the podcast and your counseling services in the show notes, so that people can find out more about that if they're in your local area, or even in any of those other areas that you mentioned, so that they can utilize those services if that makes sense for them. I do like the remote aspect of it for for some people, because some people just aren't comfortable going and walking into a place like that and having those conversations in person. And if they can do it on the other side of a screen, that might take away a little bit of that anxiety about going into the office like that. So that's definitely a great service, and it's probably something that COVID has brought up and made it a little bit easier to normalize that type of thing. So that's a great service as well. So thank you again for coming on the show and joining me and telling us a little bit about what you do and how military and veteran couples can get on the right path if they're not already, and stay on that path to help improve their relationships and have a good relationship going throughout their entire marriage. So thank you again for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Drive On Podcast.